12:25 a.m. A distress signal across the wires delivers the news. The White Star ship Titanic has hit an iceberg. 4 hours later, a passing ocean liner picks up around 700 survivors.
Cold, wet, terrified. They were on what was supposed to be the unsinkable ship.
1,500 people are still unaccounted for. This is the story of what happens next. The voyage of the cable ship, sent on a mission to recover the bodies of Titanic's lost passengers. The struggles of one man who must devise an entirely new forensic system to identify the dead.
He's thrust into the position of having to look after the identification of these bodies coming in from the Titanic.
The rarely seen photographs taken to aid that identification. And the search by the relatives of the victims, which goes on even today, for the truth of what happened that fateful night.
This whole cemetery really is a monument to the White Star Line's arrogance and recklessness. That's how I see it. I feel very angry standing here.
Halifax, Nova Scotia, the nearest big port to the site of the sinking. 750 miles northwest of where Titanic went down. By an accident of geography, the people of this city will take center stage in one of the greatest dramas of the 20th century.
Captain's log, 16th of April, just before dawn. Mackay Bennett has been chartered by the White Star Line, owners of Titanic. Our mission is to sail at speed to her last known position.
Frederick Lander is the captain of the Mackay Bennett cable ship. His job? To get to the site as soon as possible and retrieve Titanic's bodies. The whole world wants to know who has survived the sinking of Titanic. But Lander and his seasoned crew of Nova Scotians must find those who are still missing and presumed dead. 75 local men from Halifax's nearest fishing villages have stepped up to the task of crewing the ship. They'll be paid double wages for the grim days that lie ahead.
The Mackay Bennett set off 2 days after the Titanic sank. There were strong winds and currents carrying the bodies many, many miles.
The Mackay Bennett was built to navigate through ice and fog. She's equipped to find deep-sea cables and repair them. For this mission, her crew loads her with coffins instead of cables.
The White Star Line sent the Mackay Bennett out with 103 coffins on board, so their expectations weren't very high.
Expectations are low, because before Titanic broke in two and sank, only 1/3 of the passengers made it into lifeboats. They were picked up by the only passing passenger ship that could get to the scene. The rest were left behind to die.
Liners were still carrying on between Southampton and New York and between Halifax and other places, but they had no provisions for dealing with dead bodies, so they just carried on. And passengers reported their horror of seeing women in the water clutching children, and one woman even clutching a shaggy dog who was obviously her companion on board.
Nothing remains of the great ship but debris. The night Titanic sinks, the water temperature in the North Atlantic is a punishing 2 degrees below freezing. At that temperature, hypothermia quickly sets in, forcing the heart into a state of uncontrolled rapid beating. It's trying to generate heat, but instead draws blood away from the brain and vital organs. In these extreme conditions, Captain Lander knows the average survival time is less than an hour. Back in Halifax, this is the man left in charge. His job is to prepare for the bodies of the victims and identify each and every one. Not easy, with 1912 forensic technology.
Very well. Thank you. Please get a message to the ship. Tell Captain Lander that we are preparing on land for as many bodies as they can muster.
John Henry Barnstead is the registrar for Halifax. He keeps records of who's been born, who gets married, and who dies. Usually it's a low-profile job, but not now.
All of a sudden, to paraphrase, all hell breaks loose. He's got to make a move. He's got to get down and get ready for an onslaught.
John Barnstead Jr. is a descendant of John Henry Barnstead. He wants to know how his relative became an unsung hero of modern forensics.
He passed away the year I was born, so I didn't know John Barnstead at all. And I really wanted to find out more about him when I realized the importance he played in the aftermath of the Titanic. It's very exciting to be able to find out what he actually did.
All the town's mortuaries have been cleared, and undertakers from all over the province are on standby. Barnstead is leaving nothing to chance. But the impact of this disaster will be felt far beyond the coastline of Canada. All around the world, families have woken up, not knowing if their loved ones are alive or dead. Passengers on lifeboats may have been picked up and might now be on their way to New York. But Titanic's owners, White Star Line, know very little and won't give any details.
Yes? No, I have absolutely no comment on the whereabouts of the rescue ship or where she is heading.
Now the scramble will be to find out who has lived and who has died. This will only become clear when the survivors reach New York. When the Mackay Bennett gets to the wreck site to retrieve the dead. And when a new forensic master plan is unveiled in Halifax, Nova Scotia, for the identification and burial of them. It's 2 days since Titanic went down, and it's not clear exactly what happened or how many people have survived. Aboard the rescue ship heading for New York is Madeline, 5 months pregnant, wife of Titanic's richest passenger.
Pregnant, not knowing whether your husband was going to make it off of the ship and be rescued would have put a lot of stress on her.
The name of Madeline's husband is John Jacob Astor. His granddaughter is Jackie Astor Drexel.
My grandfather was very cool under fire. He was truly a gentleman. He accepted very easily the fact that women and children were supposed to go first. He put his wife on the lifeboat and kissed her goodbye.
Marconi office, what's your message?
The Marconi Company has everything to gain from Titanic. It's the high-tech startup of its day, using the new medium of radio waves to send and receive messages.
Yes, sir.
Marconi's technology will be central to the unfolding drama. Within hours of Titanic sinking, Vincent Astor, son of John Jacob, rushes to the Marconi office in New York, frantic for news of his father.
Can I help you, sir?
My father is John Jacob Astor. He must be found and a passage secured for him back to New York.
Certainly, sir.
If he's not found alive, if he's given his life for others, there will be a substantial reward for whoever can find and identify him.
Yes, sir.
I'll wait here till I receive a reply.
Vincent was kind of an isolated character. He was a very lonely, sad person. And I believe he stayed up all night long waiting for news about the Titanic with the radio operator. It must have been devastating.
Downtown from Marconi, at number 9 Broadway, crowds are standing outside White Star Line, shouting one word: murderers. And the pressure on the company will only get worse.
A lesser shipping line than White Star will be broken by this disaster.
John Hume, known as Jock, was the violinist in Titanic's band. His music calmed the passengers as the ship began to sink. Jock's grandson has spent years trying to find out what happened to Jock during and after the sinking.
When it was announced that the Titanic was sinking, the band were immediately summoned into the first-class saloon to play while the first-class passengers were putting on their life jackets.
Jock Hume had first gone to sea when he was 14, a free spirit with dreams of becoming a concert violinist. And now, the White Star Line doesn't seem to care what has become of their star performer.
No reply from Liverpool, Southampton, or London, and still nothing in the papers.
Andrew Hume, a violin teacher, is Jock Hume's father. He and Jock's stepmother, Alice, are worried sick. It's from this house, in the Scottish town of Dumfries, that Andrew Hume will set off to find some answers. The family home of Christopher's grandfather and great-grandfather.
2 days after the sinking, Andrew Hume still did not know whether his son was dead or alive. He'd sent telegrams to the Foreign Office. There was no reply. The local police had no information. The White Star Line didn't answer his telegrams.
Christopher retraces the journey made by Andrew Hume to Liverpool and the head office of the White Star Line.
The most dramatic descriptions of the sinking and the aftermath were in the Daily Sketch, a very popular tabloid newspaper. And it reported that in Liverpool, outside the White Star Line offices, women with babies in their arms, their cheeks pale and drawn, their eyes red with weeping, have stood for hours reading and rereading vague messages of the disaster which the company posted up. But there were very few names on those lists. And Andrew Hume stepped off the train and walked to Lime Street and found himself among people who were in a state of despair about their loved ones.
From Lime Street Station, Andrew Hume walks along Church Street to the White Star offices.
Well, it is still a very, very fine landmark in the city, but it's empty and has been for some years. It's boarded up, and there is nothing outside to say what it once was, except that it was the headquarters of the Oceanic Company, the main company of the White Star Line. But there is no mention of the Titanic, which was the author of its destruction.
3 days after the sinking, the White Star Line is still saying as little as possible about the disaster.
Andrew Hume was given no information that satisfied him about Jock. They couldn't confirm whether he was alive or dead. So he went from the White Star Line to the offices of Blacks, the musical agents, to see if they had any information.
These were once the Liverpool offices of Black Brothers. They provided musicians for passenger ships, including all 8 band members on Titanic. And it's here that Andrew is told what he dreads most.
the Black brothers gave him the terrible news that there was no hope left at all, that according to all the information they had, that the band had gone down playing Nearer My God to Thee. And Andrew would have come down these stairs afterwards, a broken man.
It's devastating news. If Jock was last seen playing a calming hymn for the first-class passengers, Andrew knows there is little chance his son would have made it onto a lifeboat. Soon the White Star Line will confirm the appalling truth. Only 1/3 of Titanic's passengers have been rescued and are being brought to New York. It's highly unlikely anyone else will be found alive. From now on, every piece of news will be highly sensitive. Soon the world will know who is safely aboard the rescue ship and who is not. And that's when the true magnitude of the mission to recover the bodies will hit home, for the crew of the Mackay Bennett and for those waiting on shore. It's nearly 4 days after the sinking of Titanic, and at 9:45 p.m., the rescue ship bringing back survivors arrives in New York.
When word got out that the Carpathia was docking here, newspaper writers, photographers, the families of all of these people who were had no idea in some cases, whether or not their loved ones had survived, and they were actually waiting here at this dock. So the tension was palpable. And for the number of people who were there, it was amazingly silent, just holding their breaths, waiting.
The site of the ship's historic homecoming is now the disused Pier 54 on New York's west side. As the rescue ship docks, reporters crowd in. And Madeleine prepares to face her stepson, to confirm the terrible truth.
Waiting by the dock was Vincent Astor with a change of clothing for Madeleine. And in fact, the whole crowd was just waiting to see what the bride, the woman who had left town as a newlywed, was coming back as a widow. She appeared at the gangplank. She must have felt as adrift as she was in the freezing Atlantic. What would her life be? Where could it go? After being, the famous bride of this famous man, what did the future possibly hold in store for her?
When Vincent sees Madeleine alone, he knows his father is never coming home. But until a body is found and identified, no one can be sure what has become of John Jacob Astor. No one can be sure of what has happened to any of those who have not made it home. Alive or dead, their fates remain unclear. The man who holds the key to that mystery is John Henry Barnstead. As registrar for births, marriages and deaths in Halifax, he must deal with the influx of bodies. And he has something to prove. Another tragic shipwreck has haunted him and Halifax for nearly 4 decades. As a young man, Barnstead had watched his superiors fail in their task to bring home the bodies from another White Star vessel, RMS Atlantic, wrecked on the shores of Nova Scotia. Few bodies were identified. Their effects were stolen and families were devastated. Barnstead cannot let this happen again. He must come up with a foolproof new forensic system.
So when you're thrust into the position of having to look after the identification of these bodies coming in from the Titanic, I'm sure that he said to himself that I'm going to do this right.
Identification, numbering, effects is the Barnstead method. All bodies will be numbered, and that number with a description and list of effects, will always stay with the body.
Well, obviously he was a good administrator, but I still think more of the compassion he must have shown. That to me is the most important thing in this whole thing. He was compassionate enough to develop a system where there's not going to be any errors made, and there will be closure to the families.
Speeding out into the Atlantic, the Mackay Bennett now battles the elements, spring storms and a turbulent sea.
They knew what they were going towards, and I'm sure they were tough maritimers, a long time out in the ocean, and I think they were just preparing themselves mentally for it.
With bad weather slowing them down, it's not even certain if, by the time they get there, any bodies will be found.
There's probably no one left.
Captain Lander fears the bodies will disperse on the sea surface as a result of currents, wind, and wave motion. Direction and distance are almost impossible to predict. All he can do is get there as fast as he can.
1, 2, 3, fire!
Someone who knows these waters well is Coast Guard Phil Walker.
The drift in that particular part of the ocean is mostly from a north to south direction with regards to the Labrador Current.
Here, on a Coast Guard training exercise, volunteers demonstrate just how fast bodies can move in water.
Today we have about 5 to 10 knots of wind out of the southwest. The tide is flooding now, so that will assist a bit in the drift of those casualties. For the most part, they're drifting in a predictable way in this bay.
But the movement of bodies in the mid-Atlantic is far less predictable. In 1912, bodies and debris from Titanic are drifting up to 40 miles a day from the original wreck site.
The bodies themselves wouldn't have been affected so much by wind as by water movement, so by the currents, because they would have been weighted heavily, legs would have been down. That's good. The clothing themselves would have accepted a lot of moisture and kept them heavy.
The Titanic sinks near where the warm Gulf Stream meets the cold Labrador Current. Among the fastest moving waters in the world. Will anyone be left by the time the Mackie? It's more than 4 days since Titanic sank, and the recovery ship, the Mackay Bennett, is on her way to find the victims.
Coast Guard Cutter Sambro, Coast Guard Cutter Sambro, Charlie Golf 113, Charlie Golf 113, 1 over.
10-4. Chester Fire, Earl Grey, Roger, you can go ahead and extinguish that flare.
Here on the Coast Guard exercise, the bodies rescued from the water are being transferred onto the rescue boat.
The Coast Guard Cutter Sambro is carrying the 3 deceased casualties into Chester Harbor to a secure location where the casualties will be transferred to Mercy Health Services. And at that point, our responsibility for the casualties is done.
Phil and his crew have the latest in high-tech hoists and slings to make their jobs easier. The crew on the Mackay Bennett will have to rely on brawn and raw courage, sometimes in liquid form.
Captain's log, 19th of April. The weather is getting more treacherous. I've ordered the rum ration to be doubled from 4 ounces to 8.
The men will need all the bravery they can summon to face what they're about to find. Frederick Hamilton, the ship's engineer, keeps a detailed account throughout the voyage.
20th of April, 1912. A large iceberg, faintly discernible to our north. We are now very near the area where lie the ruins of so many human hopes and prayers. The embalmer becomes more and more cheerful as we approach the scene of his future professional activities.
John Snow is the undertaker on board the Mackay Bennett. His family still runs the local undertakers in Halifax. The ship has taken on embalming fluid, sufficient for 70 bodies. Too much or too little? Who can say? Jon Snow knows that even in the freezing cold North Atlantic, he will have to work fast to preserve the bodies. Otherwise, they will decay before they can be brought home. And until the Mackay Bennett docks in Halifax, he'll have to work alone.
There's actually documentation that Snow had the crew build him a mortuary table while he was on board. And he had his embalming fluids with him and had them set out in order to be able to do this as quickly as possible. I think he was developing sort of a mobile morgue.
The men sew bags out of sailcloth, a vital link in the Barnstead method. Each bag is stenciled with a number. This is where the contents of the deceased's pockets will be stowed. On Sunday, April the 21st, the Mackay Bennett reaches the scene of the shipwreck. Captain Launder cuts all engines. There is a moment's silence. And then the activity must begin. There is no time to lose. He orders a cutter to be lowered and records the event in his captain's log.
Drifting, wind west-southwest, force 4. Latitude 41.59 north, 49.25 west. Picking up bodies, logging icebergs, considerable swell.
Many bodies have drifted, but to the crew's surprise, others are still clustered together among the wreckage.
The cutter lowered and work commenced and kept up continuously all day, picking up bodies. Hauling the soaking remains over the side of the cutter is no light task.
They can be substantially heavy. The term dead weight is used, and there's a reason for that, simply because they're not assisting at all in the recovery.
I think what they would have seen above the water when the Mackay Bennett arrived would have been bodies that were frozen, frostbitten, frost in the hair and eyebrows, even frost on the eyelashes. They probably would have looked like they weren't in overly bad condition from the surface up. Once they started pulling the bodies out of the water, however, they probably would have noted that the lower portion of the bodies was far more decomposed than what was out of the water and above the surface.
51 we have taken on board today. 2 children, 3 women, and 46 men. And still the sea seems strewn.
Once the bodies were removed from the water and exposed to the air, that also hastens decomposition after the bodies have been wet that way. So, and then if they started to thaw out in the warmer air than the cold water temperature, then that would have hastened the decomposition as well. So the entire operation was really a race against time.
The bodies must be retrieved, stripped, examined and logged according to Barnstead's instructions. First, the bodies are laid out on deck. Then, clothes are removed and each item described and written down. Later, the clothes will be burnt to deter souvenir hunters. 2 people will always be present as the effects are collected from each body. This means nothing can be misplaced or stolen. A full inventory of the deceased's pockets is recorded to assist identification on board, or later on shore.
They were keeping a journal or a log with the descriptions of each of the bodies, again with the number assigned to that body, a description of the personal effects, putting the personal effects into the bags before they could get confused with anyone else's personal effects.
The number assigned to the body will be picked up by Barnstead on land and will follow the person through all the records.
He was a front runner in developing systems to be able to deal with crime scenes, particularly of a mass disaster.
Barnstead's principles of identification, numbering, and effects are still used by today's rescue services: fire, police, Coast Guard.
The transport officer is in charge of ensuring that the people are brought aboard. They're responsible for giving them coded numbers, whether it's a Jane Doe, John Doe, or we have their name. You've got the human element of dealing with deceased folks who we have to respect, and respect the fact that their effects are going to go to their loved ones. And for anyone who's lost anyone, they know that having that is very, very important.
The fourth body pulled out of the water on the first day is that of a little blonde-haired boy, perhaps just 3 years old. There's no indication of who he might be. His shoes are kept as the only item that might later help with identification. His is the youngest body recovered from the water. He will become famous the world over as Titanic's unknown child. Word has now reached land that the Mackay Bennett is finding bodies. This puts even more pressure on the crew. Not just to find children, not just to find the ordinary people from the ship, but to find the big names. Names like John Jacob Astor. In the North Atlantic, news reaches the Mackay Bennett that Vincent Astor has put up $10,000, around $250,000 today, as a reward for finding his father's body. And on Monday, April the 22nd, it looks as if that reward will be claimed. John Jacob Astor is quickly identified by the silk initials inside his collar, by his diamond cufflinks, and the $3,000 in cash in his pocket. Astor was one of the richest men in America and a well-known figure about town. He was often seen walking down Fifth Avenue with his Airedale terrier, Kitty, who traveled with him on Titanic and was last seen barking on deck.
My grandfather loved any kind of invention. He loved the thought of what was going on in the future. He wrote a science fiction book, of all things, kind of like H.G. Wells. And he invented many things that were copyrighted: a bicycle brake, road surfaces, a turbine engine, I think he worked on, and many other things.
The identification of Astor's body is the highest profile so far. This brings tragic closure for his family, and a story that will make headlines around the world. The most elaborate coffin on board the Mackay Bennett has been reserved for Titanic's wealthiest passenger. But as body number 124, his paperwork is housed just like everyone else's here in Nova Scotia. John Barnstead, descendant of forensics pioneer John Henry Barnstead, has come to meet Gary Shutlak, archivist of the largest Titanic collection in the world. These archives house the authentic documents created on the instructions of John Henry Barnstead.
Now, have you ever in your family heard of him having devised this system? Anything in the family about these, any stories about this anywhere?
Not until about 10 years ago, when my daughter Googled it on the computer. And all of a sudden, we find John Henry Barnstead, who is my grandfather, John Henry Barnstead, who then we learned that he wasn't the one involved. It was John Henry Barnstead, his cousin. And we found out that he was the one involved with the identification of the Titanic victims.
The way the system worked, John, was that this book was carried on the Mackay Bennett. And basically, each page was dedicated to one of the bodies recovered from the Titanic. And as you can see, this particular page says unidentified, and this gives a particular individual's name. And then once they got back here, they went through all the material and produced the record we'll have here. This is perhaps the most famous man who was on board the Titanic, John Jacob Astor. You have, for instance, his age, his clothing, his effects. This body number was put on the coffin or in the canvas bag the individual was in. And again, as you can see, they've made
number 124. Yeah.
And clothing, again, in effect.
John Henry Barnstead wanted Titanic's records to be held here for future generations.
Well, it's just amazing that this was by his direction and was part of getting the wonderful records together that enabled him to make positive identification on so many bodies. And it all started with this book. And this was the one that was actually out at sea, near where the Titanic went down. Fascinating.
If it were not for these records, dozens of families would have been left without closure. But there are still weeks, even months. Around the world, families desperately wait for news from Titanic's wreck site. But until proof of death is found, it's human nature to keep hope alive. In the Scottish town of Dumfries, factory worker Mary Costin is the fiancée of Titanic violinist Jock Hume. His family does not approve of the match. But Mary and her mother have nowhere else to turn for information about Jock. Christopher Ward is Jock's grandson, and he is researching Jock and Mary's story. A week after Titanic hits the iceberg, Jock is already being hailed a hero in his hometown. But no one knows what's become of him. Before Titanic set sail, Mary Costin had waved off Jock Hume at Dumfries Station.
It was a very emotional farewell when he was going off on a really special trip. It was the maiden voyage of the Titanic, and Mary came with him to the station, and they ran down the stairs, and they arrived on the platform just as the train was pulling in.
Mary had just told Jock she was pregnant. He was going to be a father. They agreed to keep it secret until his return.
He jumped onto the train and opened the window, and they kissed goodbye. And of course, that was the last time she saw him.
Jock's last communication from Titanic was a postcard sent to Mary from Southampton. He wants to marry her, no matter what his family thinks.
Andrew Hume was very ambitious for his son and was really expecting him to marry above himself, not below himself. He didn't want to see Jock saddled as he saw it with a girl from a poor family.
Do not call here again, young lady. And no, I have no news.
That same night, in the mid-Atlantic, Captain Launder confirms to his crew that the Astor reward money will be theirs.
Look on this as just reward for all the hard work you are doing. Not just for the wealthy, but for all these poor souls. Everyone is equal in the eyes of the Lord.
But not everyone is equal when it comes to what happens to their body once retrieved from the ocean. The Mackay Bennett has run out of coffins. Now come difficult decisions.
Captain's log, Monday, the 22nd of April. Hands sewed up, 24 unidentified bodies, and attached, a 50-pound weight to each.
Sometimes bodies are so damaged that identification is impossible.
Some of the bodies were not in very good shape, obviously having been in the water for a few days and frozen. Some of the bodies may have been mangled or have undergone some sort of trauma, depending upon how those bodies left the ship.
I commit thee unto the deep. Burial at sea requires water depth of at least 600 feet and a weight inside the shroud to prevent the body from floating. Anticipating this, Captain Lander has stowed great iron in the ship's hold. It's simply not possible to bring everyone home. Later, it becomes clear. Nearly all bodies buried at sea are third-class passengers or crew, returned to the deep with proper religious ceremony, but never to be seen again.
We can tell from the documentation there was a lot of reverence in dealing with the bodies. Certainly, I think that they were trying to be as respectful as possible.
Frederick Hamilton, the chief engineer, records the scene in his diary.
The words, "We therefore commit his body to the deep," are repeated, and at each interval comes splash as the weighted body plunges into the sea, there to sink to a depth of about 2 miles. Splash, splash, splash.
Burial at sea is always a difficult thing to do because people want closure, families want closure.
Once the Mackay Bennett returns to port, the controversy over sea burials will rage for months.
I don't think it's fair to judge people then by today's standards because they only had so many things to work with. Today we have all the technology and DNA investigations and so on. They had nothing back then, and I think it's unfair, really, to compare.
On the evening of the 22nd of April, a second rescue ship leaves Halifax to join the search for bodies. It will arrive 3 days later. Meanwhile, the Mackay Bennett must keep on hunting. And on the following morning, the body of one of Titanic's bandsmen is pulled out of the sea and given the number 193. Could this be the body of violinist Jock Hume? His grandson Christopher Ward has come to Halifax to find out why Jock's loved ones had to wait so long for answers.
Stories were already coming in that the Mackay Bennett had picked up close to 100 bodies. Well, when you think there were 1,500 people dead in the water out there, the chances of Jock's body being among them was, 20 to 1, I guess. Very, very slender indeed.
On Tuesday, the 23rd of April, body number 193 has been brought on board by the crew of the Mackay Bennett. First, the body is examined for all distinguishing marks, height and approximate weight.
193. Male. Height, 5'9". Weight, 145 pounds.
They described him as being 27 years old, and Jock was 21 years old. I suspect when they told his father that a bandsman had been found aged about 27, that he dismissed this immediately as not being Jock.
Hair, light, curly, clean shaven.
Once the identifying features are noted down, the body is prepared for embalming.
The embalming process involves cleansing the bodies to remove surface bacteria. It involves replacing the fluids of the body. So you're trying to replace the blood, basically. And to do that, nowadays, we have complicated systems that use pressure and can basically replace the fluid as the embalming fluid is being pushed in. At that time, it would have been a little less highly technical. The preservatives were much more basic, much more raw They would have used ethanol and methanol and formaldehyde, which, as we know, are now also formaldehyde is a very dangerous chemical even to the person who's using it.
There'll be no coffin for body number 193. Just storage below deck, on ice. The shocking number of deaths from Titanic has the whole world on edge. And nowhere is that more evident than the docks at Southampton, where Titanic's sister ship Olympic is about to set sail across the Atlantic. Two weeks ago, Titanic left port with too few lifeboats. Now the eyes of the world are on White Star's other luxury liner.
Only 20 lifeboats on Olympic. Same as Titanic. Oh, we have to get a message to Southampton right away.
Despite the tragedy, Olympic is about to set sail without enough lifeboats. The place is in uproar.
I don't care where they get them from. We need more on the ship now.
In the end, 40 collapsible boats taken from military ships are loaded on board. But they are barely adequate for the job.
And they went for these kind of jury-rigged folding lifeboat designs that were old, they were rotted. And when the crew tested them, at least one of them didn't work at all. It was falling apart. And here they were told they had to set out to sea with these inadequate lifeboats. And I don't think they were just worried about themselves, they were worried about their passengers.
The New York Times assigns a reporter to the story.
After examining them, the men were appalled to find that the boats were rotten, unseaworthy, and for the most part, unfit for purpose. With only 3 exceptions, the entire crew, the firemen, greasers, and trimmers, stopped work.
10 days later, in this courthouse, the crew is found guilty of mutiny, but are given an immediate pardon.
Understood. So the sailing will be delayed until there's proper lifeboat provision. And we'll announce that as a result, Olympic will be late arriving in New York. Okay.
White Star Line has been forced to admit defeat. No more liners will leave port without enough lifeboats. Back in Halifax, tension mounts. The town is filling up with anxious relatives waiting for news.
It must have been ghastly for them because, in one sense, the best news was that their partner was dead and on the ship, and the worst news was that they were dead anyway and would never be found again. No grave to mourn, no place to visit them.
John Henry Barnstead's plans are in place. All he can do now is wait anxiously along with everyone else. The Mackay Bennett is still out at sea. Her grisly work is nearly complete. But a heavy fog has now settled. The chief engineer, Frederick Hamilton, records the scene in his diary.
Wednesday, 24th April. Cold, wet, miserable, and comfortless. All hands balance themselves against the heavy rolling of the ship as she lurches to the Atlantic swell. And even the most hardened must reflect on the hopes and fears, the dismay and despair of those whose nearest and dearest support and pride have been wrenched from them by this tragedy.
By Saturday, the 27th of April, 306 bodies have been recovered. The rest of the 1,500 missing have either sunk with the ship or been dispersed by the sea. The Mackay Bennett hands over the job of recovering the last few bodies to her support ship and turns for home.
Moderate breeze. Hand stowing corpses on bridge deck and securing coffins on poop.
Now the world watches and waits. The Mackay Bennett will soon be docking at Halifax. But will the docking of the ship of death bring comfort or despair to the waiting relatives? In the early morning of Tuesday, the 30th of April, 15 days after Titanic sinks, the Mackay Bennett docks in Halifax, Nova Scotia. The Halifax Herald writes that her afterdeck is piled high with coffins, and on her forward deck, 100 unshrouded bodies.
The whole world was waiting for the return of the Mackay Bennett, but it was from this point on Citadel Hill in Halifax that the ship was first seen coming into the harbour. It was a cold, foggy late April morning when it was spotted just coming around McNabb's Island. And that was the sign that the cathedral should start tolling its bell. And as the cathedral bells rang out, so did 40 other church bells across Halifax in a great chain of grief across the city. Thousands of people, many of them with people on the Titanic, were lining the jetties and the wharfs, waiting for the Mackay Bennett's return.
At 9:30 a.m., Mackay Bennett moors at Halifax's flagship pier. All present stand silent, with heads bare.
When it came past St. George's Island there, they could see the bodies piled high on the deck, and there was a great sort of intake of horror and shock as they saw that.
The world's press had been kept informed by a Marconi machine set up by the Press Association at the dockyard entrance.
Total bodies recovered from the Mackay Bennett, 306. Number brought to Halifax, 190. Number identified and buried at sea, 56. Number unidentified and buried at sea, 60. Number identified and brought to Halifax, 65. Number not identified and brought to Halifax, 125.
Now John Henry Barnstead must tackle the job of sorting through the 190 recovered bodies in as few days as possible. His professional expertise under the spotlight. It takes 3.5 hours to unload the ship of its gruesome cargo. Amongst the waiting crowds is Vincent Astor. He has traveled up from New York in 3 private railway cars. His father's body will be transferred to New York within 24 hours. But the majority of Titanic's victims will never make it home.
We regret we do not see our way to bring home the bodies of those recovered free of expense. In cases where it is desired for this to be done, it can only be carried out upon receiving a deposit of 20 English pounds.
Families will have to pay to have their loved ones brought back to them, and most cannot afford it. Of 190 bodies, 150 will never leave Halifax. From the docks, they're brought to the Mayflower curling rink. This is the only place large enough and cold enough to store the bodies. The club has now moved to new premises, but the legacy remains.
Finding out that he used the Mayflower Curling Club is another piece in the puzzle. I'm learning more and more as we go along about John Barnstead Sr. and knowing in my mind the way that he would have this place set up for the next of kin when they come in to see their loved ones continues to make me proud. He knew that when the bodies came in from the Mackay Bennett that they would be deteriorating, and he had to find a place that was cold and a good layout that he could work with.
Bodies are taken to the main area of the rink, where canvas cubicles are set up so families can view the open coffins.
There's the privacy issue and wanting to make sure that the bodies are treated with respect.
To deter souvenir hunters, only a very few items of clothing are saved, including the baby shoes that belonged to the unknown child, fished out of the water by the Mackay Bennett. Canvas bags containing deceased's valuables Letters and trinkets of the dead are kept with the bodies until burial is possible. John Henry Barnstead is busy issuing burial certificates. In each case, the cause of death is listed as accidental drowning, SS Titanic, at sea.
They probably didn't drown. They probably froze to death. But it's just something that people say, and it's sort of accepted. And I think bodies in water are sort of accepted to have been drowned, even if that's not necessarily the case.
Barnstead knows that arguments over cause of death can cause needless delays and suffering for the families.
It wasn't just about the bureaucracy. I think he was concerned about the identification of the bodies, repatriating those bodies to their loved ones. I think he was concerned for the people who were going to have to deal with the disaster.
The same day that bodies are being taken to the curling rink in Halifax, the post is delivered to George Street, Dumfries, home of the missing violinist Jock Hume. It always arrives promptly at 8 a.m. Each day without news brings disappointment, but no one expects the letter, when it does come, to add insult to injury.
It's from Black's Brothers. Dear sir, we shall be obliged if you will remit to us the sum of 5 shillings and 4 pence, which is owing to us based on the enclosed statement. They're asking us to pay for our dead son's uniform.
It's now 3 days since the Mackay Bennett brought home the bodies of Titanic's dead to Halifax, Nova Scotia. Churches such as this one, St. George's, are being prepared for a series of mass funerals. The atmosphere in the town is somber and sorrowful as the first 36 numbered coffins are taken to be buried.
There must have been an enormous amount of anger along with the sorrow. And I think the anger grew as time went by. And there was a tremendous sense of loss, which was an unnecessary loss for those who died on the Titanic.
On Saturday, May the 4th, the funeral of John Jacob Astor takes place in Rhinebeck, New York. His body is then interred in the family mausoleum. He leaves behind a grieving son and a pregnant widow.
An 18-year-old widow. This is a girl who had never been outside of the protectorship of a man, whether it was her father or her husband, and suddenly she was all alone in the world. And the only man in her life was going to be her hostile stepson, Vincent Astor. What would her life be? Where could it go? After being, the famous bride of this famous man, what did the future possibly hold in store for her?
Back in Halifax, another very different funeral is underway.
Imagine the emotion in this church as 500 people came to the funeral of the 3-year-old unknown child. The Astor family offered a $10,000 reward for the recovery of Astor's body. And true to their word, when the ship docked, Lander was given, Captain Lander was given the reward money, which he shared with the other members of the crew.
The crew used the Astor reward money to pay for the funeral and carried the tiny coffin themselves. The service is conducted by the Anglican vicar, who'd been on board with them when the body was found at sea.
I commend thee unto the earth, ashes to ashes, dust to dust.
The generosity of the crew of the Mackay Bennett was in stark contrast with the behavior of the White Star Line that neglected its duty of care to its passengers and crew, and then afterwards never even said sorry. And that is a shocking, shocking truth about what happened after the Titanic.
By now, the body of Wallace Hartley, Titanic band leader, is on its way to England for a hero's funeral. He was recovered 3 days before the Mackay Bennett turned for home and identified immediately.
Why was Wallace Hartley, the band leader's identity established so quickly?
There were a number of items which had WHH on them, including his gold fountain pen, his silver matchbox, but I think most telling, of course, is the telegraph to Hartley, bandmaster Titanic. There probably was a list of passengers and crew on board the ship, and once they got the name Hartley, they knew it had to be Wallace H. Very quick.
Jock's family and his fiancée, my grandmother Mary, were in some distress, understandably, not knowing whether his body had been recovered or not. And it must have made it all the more difficult waiting to hear.
On Monday, the 6th of May, more bodies, many of them still unnamed, are buried at Halifax's Fairview Lawn Cemetery. On that day, body number 193, the young man in the band uniform, is buried but still unidentified.
He had no name. 100 years later, 40 of the 121 tombstones have got no names on them, just numbers. Number 257, described as 5'7", age 38, green striped shirt, wearing a boiler suit, possibly an engineer. To the right of him is 179, possibly a fireman, small light moustache, 190 pounds. But no one has been to claim either of them. And this whole cemetery really is a monument to the White Star Line's arrogance and recklessness. That's how I see it. I feel very angry standing here.
While the funerals are going on, John Henry Barnstead is still at his desk.
Barnstead was representing the people of the city of Halifax. That was on his shoulders. Not only the compassionate side, to do it right for the families of the victims, but to show Halifax that they had somebody who was going to do the job correctly so that Halifax would feel good about the recovery of the bodies.
The following Friday sees the last of the mass burials at Fairview Lawn Cemetery, as another 33 bodies are laid to rest.
I have been involved in trying to identify 3 of the victims that are buried in Halifax. And Barnstead's methods are still very, very valid, because even with DNA, you have to have something to compare it to. So if you can't try to determine which of those numbered bodies belongs to which family based upon the documentation, it's like searching for a needle in a haystack.
And John Henry Barnstead has arranged for one last forensic safeguard to help with identification for generations to come. In Halifax, Nova Scotia, there are still nameless Titanic victims waiting to be buried.
A lot of the bodies could not be identified by the relations because they couldn't get over here. They couldn't come from, the victims were from all over, and there were people in Europe that couldn't get over here. They just didn't have the means to come over. So John Barnstead had to devise a method to help them identify in some other way. So he took photographs.
John Henry Barnstead brings in a local photographer to carry out the grisly task of photographing all the unidentified corpses. The use of forensic photography for identifying bodies is still a new science in 1912. These photographs show actual Titanic victims. They're held in private collections and rarely, if ever, displayed. And in the end, could it be photography that will solve the mystery of unidentified bandsman number 193? Inside the Mayflower curling rink, it's quiet for the first time in over 10 days. John Henry Barnstead's job is nearly done. Of all the bodies brought back to Halifax by the Mackay Bennett and the other ships, only 4 remain. Newport, Rhode Island, 1912. The playground of Manhattan's super rich. Had John Jacob Astor survived Titanic, he would have come here with his new wife, Madeline.
Newport was the first American summer colony. It was how to get out of the heat of New York City. And they all used to go by boat. And my grandfather loved his boat, the Norma. And he would commute from up the Hudson River all the way around and up to Newport. And it was a wonderful place, started actually by my great-grandmother, John Jacob's mother.
Astor's marriage to Madeline scandalized Newport. He was 47 and had been married before. She was 18, younger than Astor's son, Vincent.
Madeline was beautiful, sweet-natured, unlike his first wife, very athletic. She was a great tennis star. He fell instantly in love with her because she really wasn't just a social butterfly. She was someone who was fun and gregarious and substantially younger, but obviously very appealing.
As a teenage bride, Madeline had been shunned. But as a sudden widow, high society rallies round. Titanic changes everything.
Newport should have been very affected by the sinking of the Titanic. On a very abstract level, it was a big wake-up call that bad things can happen to rich people.
Through the summer of 1912, Madeline stays in the Astor Mansion in New York, waiting for her baby to come. She's won sympathy and acceptance from most, but not from her dead husband's family.
Vincent was poised to literally inherit the throne. And suddenly, there was another child coming. And yes, there was a 50% chance of it being another boy. So it was a mindset that probably had not occurred to him because life seemed so stable. And suddenly, down went the Titanic, and Vincent's life was in a state of upheaval.
Downtown, at the Marconi office, they want to be the first with the news of the Astor birth. It's a big story. On Wednesday, the 14th of August, exactly 4 months after Titanic hits the iceberg, Madeline Astor gives birth to a son, John Jacob Astor VI, weighing 7 3/4 pounds. The newborn is now heir to $3 million, or 5% of the Astor fortune. Vincent sends a box of American Beauty roses, but does not visit Madeline.
She took his father away from her, and he now felt responsible for his stepmother and the new baby coming along. But I think he must have felt like she'd stolen him away.
Vincent's heartbreak has echoes all over the world. In Dumfries, Friday the 9th of August would have been Jock Hume's 22nd birthday. And after months of uncertainty, there's finally been a breakthrough in identifying his body. Christopher Ward, Jock's grandson, has been able to work out the exact sequence of events. In the archives at Nova Scotia, he's discovered that John Henry Barnstead's attention to detail has made identification possible.
We had the actual full file of John Law Hume, beginning with basically what we call a master sheet, giving his sex, his approximate age, his hair, the number, what clothing he was wearing at the time, the effects found on his body, and buried somewhere after the 2nd of May. We have a letter from Mr. Wengate saying that the body has been identified from a photograph as that of John Law Hume.
Take this down, please. To Frederick Mathers, Deputy Provincial Secretary, Halifax, Nova Scotia. Tuesday, 16th of July, 1912. Dear Sir, number 193, unidentified. Our Southampton office have advised us that they have been able to identify number 193 as John Law Hume, bandsman of the Titanic, from the photograph. We had expected to identify this body as the uniform and effects indicated that it was one of the bandsmen. The parents of Mr. Hume have asked for the effects, which are of trifling value, so we hope you may see your way to let us have them, which we will greatly appreciate, etc., etc.
On Thursday, the 22nd of August, a package is delivered to 42 George Street, Dumfries. Inside that package are the contents of Jock's pockets, collected, stored and numbered 4 months earlier on the Mackay Bennett. When the package is opened, Jock's effects are still in the mortuary bag, smelling of seawater. Jack's pocket watch, his leather cigarette case, 2 lead pencils, 3 halfpennies, a violin mute, and an African Royal Mail brass button, the sum of all his worldly goods.
I feel like a detective who can close a file at last and yet still has an immense emotional attachment to the paperwork as well as the inquiry.
Now that Christopher Ward knows what happened to his grandfather, he can finally pay his respects at the old Mayflower curling rink, temporary mortuary for Titanic's victims, now an Army and Navy store.
So this is where Jock's journey ended. He boarded the Titanic nearly 3 weeks earlier. This is where he ends up.
It's hard to imagine here, I mean, looking at these racks of clothes and everything, it's hard to imagine that this was a curling rink, still less a mortuary, and yet here there were 60 mortuary slabs, wooden tables hastily erected where the dead were laid out. I feel terribly sad to see him lying on a table where he was frozen, lifeless. It was a terrible end to a dream, a young man's dream, and to end up here was just awful for him and for everybody else who was involved in the tragedy. And it doesn't matter how many flags are flying and how many jackets are hanging on racks, it will always be a mortuary, this room.
Final confirmation had come from a photograph taken before his burial, which was sent to his employers in Southampton. That photograph has now been lost, but its existence proves the strength of the Barnstead method, that it is indeed possible to identify victims from beyond the grave. Here in Dumfries, a unique violin takes center stage. This is an actual instrument made for Jock Hume, the violinist who went down with Titanic. Watching the violinist play is Christopher Ward, Jock's grandson. Jock Hume was just 21 when the ship sank, but heroically kept on playing in order to keep the passengers calm.
We look at Katrina on stage playing so beautifully, and you know that when it was played, and it was the last thing that anybody heard as they pulled away from the ship in the lifeboats, was the sound of the band playing Nearer My God to Thee, echoing across the water.
As Jock Hume played that haunting tune, he must have known that he would never get to meet his future child. But now Mary Costin must raise their baby on her own. As the birth draws nearer, she writes to the Titanic Relief Fund. She needs money, and she needs it soon.
I'm gonna tell him. I'm gonna tell him that I am the fiancée of Jock Hume, violinist in the Titanic's band, and that I am expecting his child in October.
A great fundraising was already underway in America and to some extent in Britain as well, for the dependents of the bandsmen.
That fundraising is crucial because the White Star Line has refused to pay compensation. They claim the band are independent contractors, not crew.
Take this straight over to the district court. They won't give it the time of day.
Poor families like the Costins are thrown back on charity, waiting every day for a reply from the Titanic Relief Fund. But when it arrives, it's not good news.
I'm to reapply after the birth, providing evidence of paternity.
She got a very polite reply back saying that they couldn't consider making any kind of an award until paternity was established, because they didn't want to besmirch the name of a good man, if indeed he wasn't the father.
The situation is desperate. The White Star Line won't help Mary, and nor will the charity set up to help the bandsmen's families. And Christopher's great-grandfather, Andrew Hume, is about to make life even more difficult for Mary Costin. It's 6 months since Titanic hit the iceberg. And in Scotland, the father of bandsman Jock Hume is looking for compensation. He's appealed for a grant as a dependent of the late Jock Hume. He says he has conclusive proof his son is not the father of the child carried by Miss Mary Costin.
I think Andrew Hume dismissed the Costins as people of having no resources and not really open to a challenge of any kind. But unfortunately for him, Mary's mother, Susan, worked for a firm of solicitors as a caretaker. And when the partners in this firm in Dumfries heard about what had happened to Mary, the way she'd been treated, they were outraged, and they offered their services free to the Costins for as long as it took to challenge Andrew Hume in court.
On Friday, the 18th of October, 1912, Christopher's mother is born. She's named John Ann Hume Costin, in memory of her father, the violinist.
In this house, 35 Buccleuch Street, Dumfries, my mother was born. And this is a picture of her a couple of years later with her mother, Mary Costin. She was far from being ashamed of having an illegitimate child. She went out of her way to show the child off. And my mother can remember her mother making starch from potatoes so that her dresses were absolutely perfectly creased and clean. And as you can see in this picture, she's wearing rather smart lace-out boots.
But when Mary Costin registers the child's birth, she cannot name Jock as the father. Andrew Hume says he'll dispute the paternity here in the Sheriff's Court.
In the event, he didn't turn up on the day. He didn't produce any evidence to contradict Mary's evidence. And she produced witnesses who were able to establish that there was a long-term relationship.
Love letters and witness statements all back up Mary's claim to be the mother of Jock's child, together with Jock's final postcard sent from Southampton.
He sent a particularly loving postcard back from Southampton the night before the Titanic sailed, saying how much he was looking forward to, and apparently this indicated his intention not only to marry her, but that was, you know, something that they both knew about, which they hadn't shared with anybody else at that time.
The court rules that there is ample evidence to overrule Andrew's claims.
At the instance of Mary Catherine Costin against Andrew Hume, music teacher, the sheriff's substitute of Dumfries and Galloway found that the said child was the illegitimate child of Mary Catherine Costin and John Law Hume, and the register was amended accordingly.
And that should be the last anyone hears of Mr. Andrew Hume. Thank the Lord.
By the end of the year, Mary is finally awarded the money that was rightfully hers. But the dark legacy of Titanic will always be there, as it will even for the families of the richest passengers on board. One year after Titanic went down, an obelisk is unveiled in Dumfries in the memory of Jock Hume, violinist on Titanic. He's the town's hero, but all his father's hopes lie in ruins.
Andrew Hume was immensely ambitious for his son, who had a huge musical talent, and he knew he was going to go places. But how ironic and how tragic that Jock should be remembered for losing his life at the age of 21 on the Titanic.
In the end, Andrew left Dumfries a broken man, moved south, and died in 1934. None of his family attended the funeral. John Ann Costin Hume, Christopher's mother, grew up to become a film publicist, working with well-known British cinema stars in the 1950s.
At the age of 15, she ran away to London and worked in a hat shop and met my father and had a family with my sister and myself, and a very successful career in the film industry.
John Jacob Astor VI graduated from St. George's School here in Newport. He inherited a further $5 million when he turned 18. Just a fraction of the family fortune, but worth $64 million today. He would eventually marry 3 times. His older half-brother, Vincent, also married 3 times. Vincent made sure that every time his own will was updated, there was no additional provision for his younger half-brother.
They couldn't have been more opposite in character. They never really spoke. I never met Vincent in my entire life. And it's too bad because Vincent could have no children, and my father had no father. They were a whole generation apart, and it could have been a perfect fit, but it didn't work, unfortunately.
The Titanic's sinking divided the Astor family, and they would never truly be reunited. The world-famous White Star Line never did recover from the loss of Titanic. She was meant to be the flagship of a class of superships, but the Enterprise was doomed.
These disasters can happen even when good people are trying to do a good job, but they're led astray by a culture that has the wrong incentives in place and doesn't reward caution, doesn't reward the care that is necessary to really avoid risk. And we see that again and again in big disasters like Titanic or the Space Shuttle or the BP spill.
The Marconi Company always claimed that the loss of Titanic was their gain. They proved they could get the news out faster than anyone else. The name of the clerk on duty the night Titanic sank was David Sarnoff. He went on to found RCA, the Radio Corporation of America. The people of Nova Scotia faced a great test in April 1912. They rose to that challenge.
I think everyone in Halifax behaved so well after the Titanic sank. The men who risked their lives going out to look at the bodies, the sailors who hauled them back onto the ship, and then the great team of people here in Halifax who worked actually to get the information out as quickly as possible.
After her work on Titanic, the Mackay Bennett reverted to being a cable ship, fixing the cables that ran the breadth of the Atlantic, linking Britain to America. Captain Launder went back to his day job. He always said the Titanic mission was the toughest job he was ever called upon to do. John Henry Barnstead remains an unsung forensics pioneer. His method became the standard system for dealing with mass disaster until the present day, including the September the 11th terrorist attacks.
We owe a lot to Barnstead. Certainly the Titanic being one of the most famous mass disasters ever. Barnstead certainly did a lot for the profession. There's a direct line from the Titanic and from Barnstead's methodology to even 9/11.
Barnstead retired 2 years after the Titanic disaster.
Even when I look back at my youth, there was very little talk about it, you know? And so he was a mystery man, for sure.
But there's one mystery that has still not been resolved. The identity of Titanic's unknown child.
How old was the child?
2 or 3. He wasn't very old.
Seems big for a 2-year-old.
Yeah.
Even though his identity may never be known, in one city at least, the memory of the unknown child remains honored to this day.